Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk about some gender stuff and some magic and kind of how those things do or don't interact in traditional Wicca. So I have a friend who is a Gardnerian high priestess who was visiting me last week, and we were talking about all kinds of things with magic and ritual and the way that you train people and so on. And I made just a very casual offhand comment. I said, and of course, we teach priests and priestesses in the Gardnerian tradition to move energy in different ways. And they sort of turned to me and said, "Do we?" Um, and this is something that I had never thought to question before. Yes, hi, everyone can see you. This is something I had never thought to question before, because to me it had always just seemed really obvious that we train priests and priestesses to move energy in different ways. But as I sat and really thought about it more, it occurred to me that this isn't nearly as much of a core teaching in the craft as I had always assumed that it was. Now, for context, my friend and I were trained in very different covens. So they were trained in a coven where gender was basically disregarded. There were a couple of occasions where they did, gendered rituals the way that you might find commonly in a lot of the Gardnerian tradition more widely. But for the most part, for just everyday, I mean, not every day, but for regular circles, gender was utterly disregarded in their training coven. I, on the other hand, came from a highly gendered coven. I came from a coven with strict gender roles, and I came from a coven that taught that gender-based polarity, or at least polarity in general, was the heart of Gardnerian Wicca. Now, anyone who's been around this channel for long enough knows that I am pretty deeply skeptical at this point of polarity as a magical concept. I don't find it useful, but it is very much the way that I was trained. And you can see it, for example, in my first book, In Kabbalah for Wiccans. I use the language of polarity to structure everything in that book. So it's certainly a part of how I was taught to do magic and how I was taught to do magic in a Wiccan context. I just find more and more that that language is not interesting or potent or useful. I think that for the most part, anything that we describe in terms of polarity could much more effectively be described using other terms. So I myself find polarity to be a pretty empty concept. But I think that the idea that I had that in the Gardnerian tradition, we train priests and priestesses to move energy in different ways comes in part from my having been trained in a coven that placed such enormous emphasis on the concept of polarity. Now, it is true that in certain contexts, without generalizing too much, because there are always going to be covens that are exceptions, but it is true that within certain contexts, there are different ways of moving magic that are prescribed to the priestess and the priest respectively. But by and large, that context, that relevant context, is at the level of the coven leaders or at the level of the ritual officiants. So in any given ritual, there isn't a priesthood and a congregation the way that there is in some other types of religious environment, but in Gardnerian Wicca, typically you're going to have a high priestess and a high priest presiding over the ritual, and then everyone else who's present is still participating, is still active, and has an important role in the ritual, but is participating in a different way than the high priestess and the high priest are. So the high priestess and the high priest are kind of set apart from the rest of the priesthood present in a ritual. And it is true that at least the way that I was trained and the way that most of the Gardnerians I've interacted with conduct things. It is true that for the high priestess and the high priest, they have particular ways of moving energy relative to each other. My friend, the cat is going insane. I'm sorry if you can hear that. My friend who was visiting last week likes to describe the relationship between the high priestess and the high priest as the person who's holding the space and the person who is holding the person holding the space. So the high priestess's job is to kind of be the ground of the circle. She holds the ritual space in place. She's collecting the energy that is being raised by everyone else present in the circle. She is directing that for various ritual purposes. So she's kind of the central point that holds everything together. She is the keystone in the arch, right? And she's the thing that keeps it all from falling down. She turns all of the sort of individual witches in the ritual into a single collective unit. And that is the magic that she is doing. The high priest is there to hold her up while she does that, because that's exhausting work. That is an overwhelming amount of magical work to do. Sorry, I bumped the microphone. Hopefully that wasn't too loud. Still getting used to this thing. It's an overwhelming amount of work to do, and it's very magically intensive, and it can be very tiring. So the high priest's job is to be the ground for the high priestess. While she is taking care of the whole circle, he is taking care of her. He is grounding her and making sure that she has what she needs. He's taking care of any small, like, not even on a magical or energetic level, but just logistically. He's taking care of things around the circle that need to be done so that she doesn't have to think about them and pay attention to them, so that she can focus on the magical work that she is doing. The analogy that I like to use a lot of the time is that the high priestess is the director and the high priest is the stage manager. So the high priestess is the one with the vision. She's the one who is responsible for really making sure that everything goes off without a hitch, that everyone knows what their role is. She is the person who creates a cohesive production. And the high priest is the one who is there to lighten the load for her, make sure that all of the details are taken care of, make sure that she has what she needs, and make sure that once she has that vision, and once she has put in the work to bring this production together, the high priest is the one who's there to make sure that the production goes off without a hitch. And, oh, good grief, Mal. She's very energetic. She's very energetic. Anyways, if you think about ritual in terms of like being like a play, it very much belongs to the director, right? The play is the director's play. The stage manager is pretty much never seen, is not highly, visible or recognized, or like the stage manager is someone who is working behind the scenes to make sure that the director's vision gets executed. And that is, again, without generalizing too much, because every coven does things differently. But the way that I was trained and the way that a lot of the covens I've interacted with work, particularly in the United States, that's very similar to the dynamic between the high priestess and the high priest. Again, this is going to differ. I don't want to make too many generalizations. You know how we feel about generalizations on this channel. But in terms of the magic, energetically, right, the high priestess has a very active role in ritual. The high priestess is powerful and forceful and commanding. She's holding all of that space. And the high priest has I don't want to say it's secondary, because I don't want to make it sound like it's insignificant, because it is significant. It's a great deal of work. But her role is to hold the energy of the entire space and to direct all of that energy. And his role is to be there for her to lean on. His role is to be her ground. And so that's the way that I was trained, that the high priestess and the high priest move energy within the circle. And I think that by and large, that's uncontroversial. I think there are lots of covens that do things differently, but I think that if I say all of that, there won't be too many covens that go, oh, that sounds really unfamiliar, right? I think that's a recognizable way in the Gardnerian tradition that the high priestess and the high priest interact in their partnership. Now, this is the point where we start to diverge. Because, and I've been talking with my friend about this like ever since, right? We've been having an ongoing text conversation. They went back to New York, but we've still been talking about this and this idea that priests and priestesses are taught to move energy differently in the tradition. Because I don't think that they would disagree with me about the high priestess and the high priest. But then there's everyone else who's present in the ritual. And I had this idea that everyone else in the ritual is interacting in that same dynamic, that same gendered dynamic that the high priestess and the high priest have. So that the men who are present in the ritual are there as stagehands, and the women who are present in the ritual, or rather the priests and the priestesses who are present in the ritual, the priestesses are there in a more active role, and they are sort of taking power from the men and directing them. And I don't know that this is something that I was ever explicitly taught as this is how you should be moving energy in the circle. What I was taught is this very like gender essentialist idea that this is how you automatically will move energy in the circle because you are a man. So I was trained in a coven, again, highly gendered. And the coven that I was trained in had this strong idea of male and female energy, and of those being two distinct kinds of energy. And if you are transgender or non-binary, it is because your energy is more male or more female, and so you're going to work energetically in the circle in the way that is more appropriate to how you are in your essential gender energy. And the idea that I was trained with is that on the physical plane, men are active and women are passive. This is fraught language. Let's be very careful about assigning passivity to women in any capacity, right? It's intended as a like men are penetrative and women are physically receptive. That is complicated for all kinds of reasons. For one, this is not the only kind of sex that people have. For another, even during penetrative sex, it is wrong to assume that the partner being penetrated is passive. Like, everyone is playing an active role in sex. But I was trained with this doctrine that on the physical, men are active and women are passive. And then on the spiritual plane, those things switch. And women are active. Female energy is the dynamic one that's going out and doing things, and male energy is the receptive one that is kind of holding space for the women. And so I was trained with this idea of a gender-based polarity as the heart of the tradition, where you need a woman who has that active energy, who can hold that ritual space, and you need a man who has the passive energy, who can be a ground for her. And you're going to create kind of an electrical circuit between the two of them, and that's how magic works. That is, in very basic terms, the doctrine of polarity and of polarity-based magic that I was trained with. And that doctrine comes out of largely Dion Fortune. This is doctrine that we see in the Kabbalistic secret societies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So you see it in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. You see it in Aleister Crowley and in Thelema, although it gets complicated in Thelema. But the clearest place that it is talked about, the clearest articulation of this doctrine, is with Dion Fortune. In particular, this book, The Esoteric Philosophy of Love and Marriage, which is a maddening book, This is a book that she published. This book almost got her kicked out of the Golden Dawn. It kind of did get her kicked out of the Golden Dawn. She published a book about sex magic, and Moina Mathers was furious with her and wanted to kick her out of the order for publishing the highest secrets of the Inner Order. And the only thing that stopped Moina from kicking Deon Fortune out of the Golden Dawn was when it was pointed out that Dion had not yet been initiated to those degrees and so could not reveal the highest secrets of the Inner Order. She'd kind of come up with this on her own, but what she had published was very similar to the doctrine of sex magic that was taught in the Inner Orders of the Golden Dawn. And this is a very frustrating book, partly because it's very cis-heteronormative, obviously, partly because it's not terribly well written, but also it is the most theosophical of Dion Fortune's books. So there's a lot of talk about reincarnation and the evolution of the soul. There's a lot of talk about the 7 planes of existence and the individuality and the personality. Those are all theosophical words. Those are all theosophical concepts that are flavoring the way that she talks about sex magic. But in particular, Dion Fortune has an idea. When you get up to the super high planes, she says the soul becomes bisexual, and it's both male and female, and it completes a circuit of polarity within itself. But on the lower planes, she says that the polarity alternates. So again, on the physical plane, we have this idea that men are active and women are passive. And then she says, speaking of polarity on other planes, specifically of the astral planes, which is the next step up from the physical, Dion Fortune writes, upon the lower astral or plane of the instincts, polarity tends to become more stable, because this plane is very closely linked to the physical, and its conditions are influenced by the physiological phases of the body. But, strange as it may appear at first sight, the sex of the second plane body is the opposite of that of the physical body. It is not difficult, however, to give the reader evidence of the truth of this statement. It is well known that a woman's love is steady, enduring, but of less intensity than a man's, whereas he reacts violently to a stimulus, and reverts to a passive condition when the stimulus is withdrawn. In this, the esotericist would see the steady flow of force through the positive male vehicle of the woman, and the sudden explosion of latent energy in the female desire vehicle of a man under the stimulus of a kinetic force. So Dion Fortune has this idea that physically, men provide the stimulus and women respond to it. Women receive the stimulus, right? The penis goes into the vagina, impregnation happens, and after a man has provided the stimulus, the woman becomes pregnant. But she thinks that psychically and magically, women provide the stimulus and men receive it. And this is an attitude that has very much worked its way into a lot of the culture of Wicca. I think especially the culture of Gardnerian Wicca in the United States, strongly influenced by this doctrine of polarity that we see presented in Dion Fortune. It is an open question how much this was present in the early days of Wicca. We do know that Gardner had read Dion Fortune, right? He cites her work in some of his books. We do know as well that Gardner says in Witchcraft Today, he says, I'm familiar with Kabbalistic magic, and for the most part, it is totally different from what the witches do. And he says the one exception is, and then he refers to like a passage in the Kabbalah Denudata that talks about women covering their hair. But he basically, without going too much into the weeds, he says the one exception is the way that Kabbalah talks about sex. He says the sexual part of Kabbalah is closely related to the way that witches think about life force and the relationship between the male and the female. So it is certainly true that Gardner and probably the other people around him were aware of something like this sexual doctrine of polarity. And at the very least, Gardner was fond of the idea that sex was a sacred and magical thing, that magical power was generated by the tension between male and female sex partners. Probably that this wasn't just about sexual intercourse, but that there was something spiritual that was built into the bodies or the souls of the practitioners. Again, remember that the early days of Wicca, very cis heteronormative, because Wicca was developed by people who were cis and heterosexual. So a lot of the assumptions that we have about sexual attraction and sexual tension and the way that that can generate magical power got folded in with assumptions about heterosexuality, about sexed bodies, right? There was sort of this idea that um, when we're talking about sex, we're also talking about lots of other things at the same time. And in particular, I have a previous video about this, but Gardner has a habit of saying fertility when he really means sex. I think if you read through Witchcraft Today and you look at every instance of the word fertility, overwhelmingly he's being coy about sex because he's writing in the 1950s. And it's safer to say this is a fertility cult than to say, hey, there's this weird thing with like sex magic and we're not all fucking each other, but it is true that there's this kind of sexual tension that underlies the kind of magic that we do, and it has something to do with the way that we're thinking about sex and sexed bodies. So the extent to which early Wicca thought in these terms of a sexed polarity is just historically muddy. It's historically unclear. Gardner himself never used the word polarity, never once used the word polarity. People who are proponents of polarity in magic will point to certain passages from his books and they'll say, like, this sounds like he's talking about polarity. And maybe he is, maybe he's not. I look at those passages and I don't see it. But it is true that this is a doctrine that existed kind of in the occult milieu at the time that Wicca was forming. And it is true that this is a doctrine that the people involved in the early days of Wicca would have been aware of. What is certainly true is that by the 70s, certainly by the 80s, but probably by the 70s, this idea of polarity, of gender-based polarity, had become very popular, had become pervasive in a lot of traditional Wiccan spaces. And so, going back to our original question, are priests and priestesses taught to move energy differently in the Gardnerian tradition? What I was taught is that I would be moving energy differently, and I couldn't help it because it was just a matter of, I am a man, this is my male energy, therefore that's how my energy is going to function within the circle. And that any other person in the circle, if they were a woman, would have female energy, and that female energy would function that way within the circle. So it's not that I was told you should move energy this way because you are a priest. Rather, I was told because you are a man, this is how your energy works, and you just need to become aware of that. And I think, generally speaking, I am deeply skeptical of any essentialist attitudes, really toward anything, but in particular toward gender. And so I tend to think of that more as a learned behavior rather than as something essential. I think the way that I am accustomed to moving energy in the circle and the way that I am accustomed to having been told that women move energy in the circle, I think in principle, any person of any gender can do either of those things. But I was trained in a coven where the assumption was that as a man, I would be moving energy this way, and that as a woman, someone else would be moving energy that way. And that those two things together would link up and create kind of an energetic circuit. And it is true that that is an effective way of working magic, right? It is true that having one person who is moving energy in that more kind of expansive and forceful way, and then having one person who's holding down the fort for them, is an incredibly powerful and effective way of working magic. it's a good way to set up a magical partnership. I don't know the extent to which other covens do that, right? There have been situations in my parent coven where, like, we had a non-binary initiate who was with us for a while, who would sometimes play the role of priest and sometimes play the role of priestess. And we would talk about how their energy was different when they were doing one or when they were doing the other. And again, it was very much framed in terms of, like, you had such masculine energy tonight, or you had such feminine energy tonight. And those are terms that I'm skeptical of that language. I don't think it's helpful language. I think that there is a particular quality of those two kinds of energy that they learned how to move around the circle. But I think that the way that we assign that quality to gender is a matter of convention more than a matter of essence, and that it is clearer and more helpful to talk about energy without resorting to those gendered terms. Your mileage may vary. So that's very much true of the coven that I came up in, but I don't know how true it is of the Gardnerian tradition more broadly, right? It may well be that I was taught, because I came up in this highly gendered circle, that I was taught that everyone in the circle was moving energy in this way or that way. Whereas in a lot of other covens, that dynamic might exist between the high priestess and the high priest, but not so much among the other ritual participants. It's possible. I just don't know. And honestly, I would love to hear from other Gardnerians. Feel free to shoot me a DM if you want to talk about specifics, because obviously there are things that we can't talk about in the comments section of a YouTube video. But no, and in particular, I think the last thing I'll say on this point, because this video is getting longer than I like my videos to be. In particular, there are aspects of Gardnerian ritual, especially the way that Gardnerian ritual is done in the US, where you are working with a partner. Right, the fundamental unit of Gardnerian Wicca is not I, but we. And sometimes that we refers to the coven, and sometimes that we refers to a magical partnership between you and another person. And I think that for me, the pattern that I have fallen into, and this is, I think, without having been ever explicitly taught it, but the pattern that I fell into because of the way that I was accustomed to talking about magic and energy in a Wiccan ritual in general, is that when I partner with someone for ritual, I am accustomed to kind of locking into them in an energetic circuit in a way that mimics the partnership of the high priestess and the high priest. So I am accustomed to saying, okay, you are my partner for this ritual, therefore I am going to be your ground while you do everything that you're doing energetically in the circle, because that's our partnership. Because I'm a boy and you're a girl, and together we're gonna do the magic, because we need both people. We need people who are doing this kind of thing and that kind of thing. And that's, I mean, I don't think that's essential. I don't think that's inherent. And I think that there are a lot of other covens where that attitude is not present. Hell, that might even be the case in my own parent coven. Right? This is not a thing that I ever really explicitly talked about with my high priestess. It's just a thing that I started to do. But I think that there are a lot of covens where there is not that assumption that when you partner with someone in ritual, if you're not the high priestess and high priest, I think there are covens where there isn't an assumption that the two of you are going to kind of lock in and create that circuit of the person who is actively doing things and the person who is holding that partner. I think there are a lot of covens where there are kind of three ritual roles. There's the high priestess, there's the high priest, and then there are the other participants in the ritual who are all moving energy in the circle and who are all participating, but who are kind of doing it in the same way, and who are all just kind of sending energy to the high priestess and high priest, or sending energy into the circle, depending on the nature of the work that's being done. And actually, incidentally, that's a thing that Dion Fortune talks about in this book. She talks about polarity in a group dynamic, and she suggests effectively that the polarity that exists in a group is not gendered, but rather is the polarity between the leader of the group and the participants in the group. That the leader is the active one who is doing things with energy, and that the participants are kind of feeding life force or energy to that leader. So that the leader, in the case of Wicca, would be the High Priestess, is again the one who has that kind of active, energetic role, and that everyone else in the ritual is just holding that space for them. So that would be a non-gendered way of thinking about what everyone else in ritual is doing while the High Priestess and the High Priest are doing their thing. And I don't know. I don't know the extent to which how I'm used to doing it or how my friend uh, talked about doing it. Like, I don't know which is more common. I don't know which is more pervasive in the tradition. I genuinely don't know whether it is true that in the Gardnerian tradition we teach not high priests and high priestesses, but just priests and priestesses present in the circle to move energy in different ways. So, again, I would really love to hear from anyone who has experience or opinions to share on this in a Gardnerian context. Like, if you want to talk about whether you were taught to move energy differently as a priest or priestess, not just in the context of leading a ritual, but in the context of being in someone else's ritual. Please do let me know. And again, feel free to shoot me a DM. For now, we are over 30 minutes, which is far too long. The average watch time on my videos is like 6 minutes. So we're going to end it here. But have a good one. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.